Bloodborne is one of the most densely layered games ever made, and tonight I'm going through all 300, one of the most fascinating, strange, and deeply overlooked facts about its world, its lore, its characters, its design, and everything in between. I put this video together because Bloodborne is a game that genuinely rewards obsession, and I have been obsessing over it for a long time. I went through item descriptions, community research threads, developer interviews, cut content documentation, and a lot of patch history, and this list is what came out of that. When I was assembling these 301 facts, I made a specific choice to organize them thematically rather than in strict chronological order. The reason for that is that Bloodborne's lore does not work in a straight line. The game reveals itself in fragments and contradictions, and I wanted this script to reflect that structure. I also made a point of using careful language throughout, because a lot of what we know about Bloodborne is interpretation rather than confirmed fact, and I think being honest about that actually makes the game more interesting, not less. Some popular theories were left out entirely because they could not be grounded in anything the game actually shows. What made the cut is either confirmed by in-game text or strongly and consistently suggested by multiple sources working together. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The City of Yharnam, Fact 1. Yharnam is not just a city, it is, based on everything the game suggests, a living monument to obsession and failure. The city's architecture alone tells you something went deeply wrong here long before the player arrives. Buildings are stacked impossibly high, balconies lean over streets at precarious angles, and the entire layout suggests a city that kept growing inward on itself rather than outward into the surrounding countryside. The game never explicitly tells you how old Yharnam is, but the presence of Pthumerian ruins beneath it suggests the city was built on top of a civilization that predates recorded history, which points toward Yharnam being far older than its Victorian-era aesthetic implies. The stone of certain lower walls is noticeably older than the stone above it, and if you look at the transitions between architectural styles in certain cathedral ward passages, the layering of eras is visible in the structure itself. Fact 2. The beast plague that devastates Yharnam on the night of the hunt is not a random outbreak. Item descriptions and environmental storytelling throughout the game strongly suggest that the plague is cyclical, that it happens regularly, and that the healing church has been managing, suppressing, and in some cases deliberately triggering it for a very long time. The scourge of beasts is not an accident but a consequence, which is one of the most quietly horrifying revelations in the entire game if you piece it together from the scattered clues left in weapon descriptions and NPC dialogue. The church did not stumble into a catastrophe, it built the conditions for one, and when the catastrophe arrived on schedule, the church treated it as an emergency rather than an outcome. Fact 3. The city of Yharnam is heavily modelled on real Victorian-era cities, particularly Edinburgh and Prague. The cobblestone streets, the gas lamps, the dense fog, the Gothic spires, and the general atmosphere of industrial poverty beneath architectural grandeur all point toward a very specific historical aesthetic. Director Hidetaka Miyazaki has spoken in interviews about his love of Gothic European architecture, and Yharnam is in many ways a love letter to that aesthetic, filtered through the lens of cosmic horror and body horror transformation. The city does not feel like a fantasy invention, but like a place someone studied carefully and then asked what would happen if everything beautiful about it went wrong in the most specific way possible. Fact 4. The enemies you encounter in central Yharnam at the start of the game are not simply mindless beasts. Many of them are former residents who have partially transformed, and if you listen carefully, some of them are still speaking. One of the first large mob enemies you encounter near the opening lamp is shouting at you in what sounds like garbled speech and, according to community research and translation efforts, some of the things the beasts say are remnants of human thought, pleas for help, warnings, and fragments of the prayers they used to recite before the blood consumed them. The transformation is thorough but not complete, and what survives it is not aggression but something closer to desperation that no longer has the language to express itself clearly. Fact 5. The large burning effigy you see in central Yharnam, the massive pile of burning corpses that lights up one of the game's earliest areas, is not just set dressing. It is a pyre maintained by the surviving residents to dispose of beast bodies. The fact that it is as large as it is and that it appears to have been burning for some time based on the volume of ash around its base suggests the scale of the outbreak in that part of the city is already catastrophic before the player even begins making progress. The residents who are still human, armed with torches and pitchforks, are losing badly. The pyre is not a symbol of resistance, but an accounting of how much has already been lost. Fact 6. The Healing Church workshop that you access through Cathedral Ward is one of the most important locations in the entire game for understanding Bloodborne's backstory, and most players miss it entirely because it is an optional area reached through a non-obvious route. Inside the workshop, you find old hunter garb, abandoned tools, and the remnants of what was once the original hunter organization before the Healing Church split from Björgenwerth and established its own hunting arm. The presence of a wooden shield in this area is quietly significant because wooden shields are considered primitive and outdated in Yharnam, suggesting the original hunters operated before the more refined equipment of the later church became standard. The workshop is a museum of a beginning that the church preferred not to advertise. Fact 7. One of the most important environmental details in Yharnam is the presence of baby cribs throughout the city. They appear in homes, in alleyways, and most prominently in certain indoor areas near the cathedral. The game never draws explicit attention to them, but their presence, combined with dialogue from several NPCs about children being taken or disappearing, and the later revelation about the Healing Church's experiments with children and the umbilical cords of great ones, suggests that the theft and use of children was not an isolated event, but a widespread and ongoing practice in Yharnam. The cribs in the houses are not remnants of ordinary domestic life. They are evidence of a system that required a specific kind of supply. Fact 8. The Gascoigne boss fight is widely considered one of From Software's best boss designs, not just mechanically, but narratively. Father Gascoigne is a hunter who has lost himself to the beast transformation, and the fight has 3 distinct phases that reflect his progressive loss of humanity. What makes it especially well crafted is that it is optional to use the music box that stalls him during the second phase, and if you choose to use it, you see him momentarily pause and clutch his head before snapping back into beast form. That detail alone tells you something is still in there, trapped and drowning. The music box contains a tune his daughter gave him. He recognizes it before he loses it again. Fact 9. Father Gascoigne's wife, whose name is never stated in-game but who is often called Viola by the community based on a reference in one piece of dialogue, is found dead in the area just beyond the Gascoigne fight. Her young daughter, who you can optionally speak to before fighting Gascoigne, asks you to find her parents. If you give the daughter her mother's brooch after finding Viola's body, the daughter thanks you and disappears. Later, if you return to that rooftop and check the area below, you find the daughter's red shoes on the ground, suggesting she fell or jumped after learning of her parents' fates. This storyline is completely optional, told through environmental details and brief NPC conversations, and it is possible to play the entire game without ever knowing it happened. Fact 10. The Cleric Beast, the game's first boss, is actually a transformed member of the Healing Church clergy, as the name implies. What is easy to miss is that the Cleric Beast is wearing the remnants of church vestments, visible if you look closely during the fight. The beast's enormous size and the distinctive, hunched, reaching shape of its upper body are consistent with a heavily transformed church cleric or hunter, and the fact that it is positioned on the Grand Cathedral Bridge suggests it may have been a prominent figure in the institution before the transformation took hold. The bridge is not a random location. It is the approach to the most sacred building in Yharnam, and whatever this was, it was still trying to get there. Fact 11. The lamp system in Bloodborne, the golden lamps scattered throughout the game that act as checkpoints and fast travel points, is never explained in-game beyond a brief tutorial note. But the lore surrounding them is actually quite interesting when you dig into it. The lamps are connected to the Hunter's Dream, which is a realm maintained by the Moon Presence and Yharnam. The fact that only hunters can perceive and use the lamps suggests they are not physical objects in the normal sense, but something more like anchors between the waking world and the dream, visible only to those who have been drawn into the dream's influence. They are not installed, they are recognized, and only by people who already belong to what they connect. Fact 12. Yharnam sits atop an enormous network of underground ruins called the Chalice Dungeons. The surface city is essentially a cap placed over something much older and much stranger. The Pthumerians, the ancient civilization that once dominated this region, built elaborate labyrinths beneath the earth to house and worship the Great Ones, and Yharnam's founders apparently discovered these ruins and built their city on top of them, which is where the blood ministration practice ultimately originates. The city has been drawing from a well it does not fully understand since its founding. Every blood treatment given to every pilgrim who came seeking healing traces back, through a long chain of derivation, to whatever was discovered in those tunnels. Fact 13. There is a neighbourhood in Yharnam called the Forbidden Woods that borders the main city, and its name is telling. The Forbidden Woods is not forbidden because it's dangerous, although it is extremely dangerous. It is forbidden because the Healing Church declared it off-limits to residents, apparently to prevent people from discovering the village of Bjergenwerth students and the experiments being conducted there. The fact that the woods are still called forbidden suggests the Church's authority over the city's residents was powerful enough to keep people away through cultural prohibition alone, without walls or explicit enforcement. The Church controlled Yharnam through language as much as through force. Fact 14. The blood vials that serve as healing items throughout the game are a core part of Yharnam's economy and social structure. Blood ministration, the practice of ingesting or transfusing Yharnam blood for its healing properties, is the entire reason people come to the city. Pilgrims travel from across the world to receive treatments that can cure diseases, heal wounds, and grant unusual abilities. What the Church does not advertise is that long-term exposure to the blood increases the risk of beast transformation, a side effect that the Church is aware of and has been managing, or rather concealing, for generations. The product works, the side effects are catastrophic. The Church knew both of these things simultaneously. Fact 15. The city's geography reveals a class structure that is not explicitly stated in dialogue. The cathedral ward and the areas surrounding the Grand Cathedral are elevated, architecturally grander, and populated by higher-ranking church officials and wealthier citizens. Central Yharnam and the areas near the river are lower, denser, and more working class in character. The beast outbreak is visibly more advanced in the lower areas, which may suggest that lower-class residents received larger or more frequent blood doses as part of cheaper blood ministration treatments, making them more susceptible to transformation. The city's social hierarchy is reproduced in the geography of its catastrophe. Fact 16. There is a recurring architectural motif throughout Yharnam involving eyes. Carved eyes appear above doorways, on statues, on church ornamentation, and in the design of equipment and weapons. This is not purely decorative. The pursuit of eyes, of insight, of higher perception, is a core philosophical and spiritual goal of the most advanced members of Yharnam's religious hierarchy. The healing church, and especially its upper tier called the choir, believed that true enlightenment came from opening a kind of inner sight, a perceptual expansion that would allow contact with the Great Ones. The eye motif throughout the city is a physical expression of that obsession rendered in stone and metal, repeated until it became invisible to the people who lived beneath it. Fact 17. The amygdalae, the enormous, multi-limbed creatures visible throughout Yharnam, if the player has enough insight, are actually present in the city at all times. They are not invaders or recent arrivals. They have always been there, perched on buildings, reaching down toward the streets, watching. The game implies that they have always been there, and that normal humans simply cannot perceive them. The fact that gaining insight reveals them suggests that the blood itself, or the exposure to Great One influence it brings, gradually opens the mind to perceiving things that were always present, but previously invisible. The city you walk through at low insight and the city you walk through at high insight are the same city described twice. Fact 18. There is a specific area in Cathedral Ward where you encounter a large number of church giants, the enormous silver-helmeted enemies that move slowly but hit with devastating force. These enemies are not random guards. Based on their attire and placement, they appear to be church-employed labourers or soldiers who were subjected to experimental blood transfusions that produced extreme physical growth as a side effect. Their enormous size is consistent with the kind of physical alteration that excess blood exposure causes, and their silver helms, which conceal their faces entirely, suggest the church was aware of their altered state and chose to hide it rather than address it. They still stand at their posts. Nobody gave them different orders. Fact 19. The Gilbert NPC, who you speak to through a window early in the game, is one of the most quietly affecting characters in Bloodborne. He came to Yharnam as a pilgrim, seeking a cure for his illness. The same reason many outsiders come to the city. He gives you useful information, and if you return to him after progressing far enough into the game, he has partially transformed. He is apologetic and lucid enough to ask you to end it if you choose to, and you can. His transformation being framed as a personal failure rather than a medical outcome says a lot about how Yharnam's residents and pilgrims internalize what's happening to them. The church taught them to see the scourge as something that happens to the weak. Gilbert believed it. Fact 20. The brick trolls, more officially called giant lost children, found early in the game near the central Yharnam sewers, and at several other locations, are not native to Yharnam's surface. They are believed to be related to the Thumerian giants, found deep in the Chalice dungeons, and their presence on the surface suggests either that they wandered up from below at some point, or that the church brought them up for some purpose. The fact that they are always found near specific locations rather than wandering randomly implies the latter. They were placed there. Whatever they were placed there to guard or discourage, they are still doing it, years after anyone who gave the order has been gone. Fact 21. The Yharnam stone, which is a key item found in the Chalice dungeons, is described as a blood gem that contains the lost wisdom of the Thumerians. The stone itself does not look like a conventional gem, but more like a carved fragment with unusual properties. Its description strongly suggests that the Thumerians encoded knowledge or memory into physical materials, which aligns with other aspects of Thumerian culture that the Chalice dungeons reveal. The concept of wisdom being literally stored in stone or blood is one of those quietly beautiful ideas the game introduces and never fully explains. The Thumerians did not write books. They crystallized what they knew and left it for whoever came after them to find. Fact 22. Yharnam's bell tower system deserves attention. The bells, both in the game's multiplayer mechanic and as physical objects in the world, have a layered meaning. The sinister bell is used by enemies to summon invaders, the small resonant bell calls cooperators, and there are physical bells in certain areas that trigger enemy spawns or narrative events. The bell is tied to the outer beings, in the game's mythology, and ringing a bell is described in some item descriptions as a way of reaching across the boundary between the waking world and whatever lies beyond it. Bells in Bloodborne are always a form of communication with something other. They are not music. They are requests sent to places that do not always answer in ways the sender anticipated. Fact 23. The Józefka's clinic area, the starting point of the game, is worth examining carefully if you return to it later. The front door is locked from the outside during the opening sequence, and Józefka, the woman behind the door, sounds warm and genuinely concerned for your welfare. As the game progresses, and you can eventually access the clinic's true interior, you discover that the real Józefka has been replaced by an imposter from the choir, the upper echelon of the healing church, who has been conducting experiments on Yharnam residents who sought refuge there. The warmth of that early voice is one of Bloodborne's quieter horror elements. The person using the kindness was not the person who felt it. Fact 24. The Mensis cage, the iron cage worn by certain enemies, and most notably by Mikolas, is based on a historical device used in early modern Europe for public punishment and display. In Bloodborne, it has been repurposed as a tool for inducing or amplifying contact with the Great Ones. The cage, according to item descriptions, is meant to simulate death and proximity to the nightmare. The idea being that the brain placed in a near-death or brain-damaged state becomes more receptive to Great One communication. It is a horrifying concept that the game delivers with complete matter-of-factness. The Mensis scholars did not develop this as a desperate measure. They developed it as a research methodology. Fact 25. The river of blood that runs beneath Yharnam, visible in certain underground areas and in some of the Pthumerian ruins, is not simply water that has been contaminated. The blood appears to flow from very deep underground, possibly from the source of the old blood itself. Some community interpretations suggest it connects directly to the Queen of the Chalice dungeons, whose blood was central to the early experiments that led to Yharnam's blood healing practices. The river being literally composed of blood is one of those game details that you might initially read as stylistic and later realize was meant exactly as stated. Yharnam is not built beside a river. It is built over one that was already there, already flowing, long before the first stone of the city was laid. Fact 26. The architecture of the Grand Cathedral, Yharnam's most prominent and central landmark, is designed to be visually overwhelming by intention. It towers above everything else in the city and is visible from nearly every elevated vantage point. Inside, it is populated almost entirely by transformed enemies and is the location of the Vicar Amelia boss fight. The fact that the most sacred building in Yharnam is now almost entirely overrun suggests how quickly and completely the beast plague has advanced by the time the player arrives. The cathedral, being one of the last places you might expect to find safety, turns out to be one of the first places devoured. Whatever protection holiness was supposed to offer, the old blood is not interested in that arrangement. Fact 27. Vicar Amelia's boss fight contains a detail that many players notice but do not initially understand. Before the fight begins, she is hunched over the altar in what appears to be prayer. She is praying. The prayer she is reciting, which can be partially made out from her voice acting, is the same prayer inscribed on the item she leaves behind after death, the gold pendant. The prayer is a plea to the gods to grant the strength to forget. The idea that a church official, in the process of transforming into a beast, is still trying to pray, still trying to hold on to something sacred, even as it comes apart, is one of Bloodborne's most poignant details. The transformation took her body. She was fighting to keep something else. Fact 28. The gold pendant that Vicar Amelia leaves behind when defeated can be used to unlock the password to the Forbidden Woods when presented to an old woman, NPC in Cathedral Ward. The fact that this pendant, a sacred church item, is the key to accessing a forbidden area, suggests that Amelia knew about the forbidden woods and what was in them. Whether she was trying to protect that knowledge by dying with the pendant rather than letting it fall into the wrong hands, or whether she simply never got the chance to act on it before the transformation consumed her, is left deliberately ambiguous. Both interpretations are consistent with her character. Neither is comfortable. Fact 29. The statues throughout Yharnam, particularly the large robed figures that appear throughout Cathedral Ward and near the Grand Cathedral, are almost certainly depictions of real figures from Yharnam's history or the church's hierarchy. In From Software games generally, statues and their placement are significant, and in Bloodborne specifically, several statues closely resemble the designs of in-game characters or boss enemies. Some community researchers have noted similarities between the statues in Cathedral Ward and the design of the moon presence, which would suggest the church had some awareness of or reverence for that entity long before the events of the game. The statues are not abstract art. They are portraits of something specific, placed where everyone could see them and dedicate attention to them every day. Fact 30. The pig enemies found in the sewers beneath central Yharnam are not, as the name might suggest, simply pigs that wandered into the sewers. Based on their size and the items they occasionally drop, including rare blood gems and human eyeballs, these creatures appear to be transformed humans or animals that were fed with the blood runoff from the city above. The sewers themselves serve as a drainage system for the blood administration facilities above, and long-term exposure to concentrated waste blood appears to have caused whatever lived down there to undergo grotesque transformation. The eyeballs they drop are particularly unsettling in that context. Something that used to be a person has accumulated enough discarded blood to grow new eyes, and the eyes are still recognizably human. Fact 31. There is a location accessible via the aqueducts near central Yharnam that leads to a large gathering of hunter-type enemies dressed in different attire from the mob residents. These are church hunters, or a variant thereof, and their presence in that location suggests the church maintained a patrol or garrison in the aqueduct area, possibly to monitor or control access to the areas below the city. The fact that they are still at their post despite the outbreak, having overtaken everything around them, suggests either extreme discipline, blind loyalty, or the possibility that they have already been infected and are operating on something more like instinct than training. They are still holding a perimeter for an institution that no longer exists to give them new orders. Fact 32. The suspicious beggar NPC encountered in the Forbidden Woods is one of Bloodborne's most effective narrative tricks. He presents as a harmless, frightened man who survived the woods and needs protection. If you guide him to an area populated by other survivors, over time the other survivors begin disappearing. The beggar is actually a beast who retains enough intelligence to deceive humans and has been feeding on the people you sent him to protect. His dialogue is written to be sympathetic and slightly pathetic in a way that makes the betrayal hit harder than it would if he had been obviously menacing. He is one of the game's few examples of a beast that is still functionally cunning, which raises the question of how many others there were that nobody recognized. Fact 33. The old Yharnam area, the section of the city that was burned in a previous purge and is now a ruined ghost of what Yharnam once looked like, gives the best visual sense of what the city was before the current outbreak. The buildings here are older, the architecture slightly different, and the entire area is soaked in ash and dried blood. It is also home to Jura, a retired hunter, who now protects the beasts of old Yharnam. His decision to protect rather than hunt the beasts is one of the game's quieter moral arguments. The beast plague is cyclical, and the beasts are victims. If you accept both of those things, then slaughtering them might not be heroism. Jura accepted both of those things, and it cost him his standing as a hunter. Fact 34. The blood-starved beast, the boss found at the end of Old Yharnam, is one of the most visually disturbing enemy designs in the game. It is a beast in an extremely advanced state of transformation, so advanced that its skin has partially peeled away, and it appears to be rotting while still alive. In the second phase of the fight, it tears off what remains of its own skin, which is a remarkable and disturbing animation. What is easy to miss is that the blood-starved beast is actually wearing the tattered remnants of foreign attire, suggesting it was a pilgrim who came to Yharnam from outside, seeking healing, and instead became this. The thing it came looking for killed it in the most specific way possible. Fact 35. The church garb that many enemies in Cathedral Ward are wearing is visually distinct from the garb of earlier, less advanced church officials. The more elaborate the vestment, generally speaking, the higher the rank of the person wearing it. This creates a kind of visual hierarchy that is readable once you know what you're looking for. The executioners, who wear a distinctive gold and white set, represent a separate faction with a specific purpose, while the church servants, in plain robes, represent the lower ranks of the institution. The visual design of the enemies is essentially a complete organizational chart of the healing church expressed through costume design. You can read the power structure of a dead institution by examining what its members are still wearing. Fact 36. The healing church's relationship with Björgenvierth, the university from which it originally emerged, is complicated and eventually violent. Björgenvierth was a scholarly institution that studied the Great Ones and the Old Blood purely from a research perspective. When certain members began advocating for a more religious or spiritual approach to the Great Ones, specifically the founders of what would become the Healing Church, a schism occurred. The church eventually broke from Björgenvierth and took a significant portion of its research and materials with it. The relationship between the two institutions is basically the story of how scientific inquiry becomes religious dogma and how dogma eventually turns on its own origins. Björgenvierth was not defeated by an external enemy. It was consumed from within by the people who learned the most from it. Fact 37. There is a hunter in Cainhurst Castle, which is an optional area of Yharnam accessible via a spectral summons carriage named Martyr Ligarius. Ligarius was a member of the Executioners, the church faction dedicated to destroying abominations. He was sent to Cainhurst to execute Queen Annalise and end her bloodline, which the church considered heretical. But rather than completing that mission, Ligarius chose to stay at Cainhurst and trap himself there with the surviving vile bloods, sealing them in and preventing them from spreading. He has been there for an indeterminate but very long time, still in his armour, still on the roof, still maintaining that seal. His action, choosing perpetual imprisonment over the cleaner outcome of execution, is arguably one of the most selfless decisions described anywhere in the game's lore. Fact 38. The Cainhurst Vile Bloods are not simply another beast variant. They are a noble bloodline that possesses blood different in nature from the Yharnam blood promoted by the Healing Church. The Church considers vile blood heretical because it does not originate from the Church's sanctioned sources and because it has properties that the Church finds threatening or uncontrollable. Queen Annalise, the last vile blood, wants to rebuild her bloodline and recruit hunters as vile blood knights, which puts her directly at odds with the Church's executioner faction. The entire Cainhurst subplot is essentially a political conflict dressed in gothic horror clothing. The Church does not hate the vile bloods because they are evil. It hates them because they represent a relationship with the blood that the Church does not own. Fact 39. The statues of amygdalae in certain indoor areas of Yharnam, small versions of the enormous creatures you eventually perceive throughout the city, function as objects used to connect with the outer beings. The presence of amygdala iconography in church architecture strongly implies that the Church was aware of and possibly reverenced these entities. Given what you learn about the Healing Church's upper echelons and their interest in ascension through contact with Great Ones, it is possible that certain branches of the church were deliberately cultivating a relationship with the amygdala rather than simply acknowledging their existence. The statues were not decorative. They were addresses, specific and deliberate, of something the church had decided deserved worship. Fact 40. The lanterns that litter Yharnam streets give off a warm, amber light that is at odds with the horror around them. This design choice is intentional. The art directors for Bloodborne have spoken about wanting the city to feel like a place that was once beautiful and habitable, a place people loved and built with care. The warm light of the street lamps is a remnant of that former life, which makes the contrast with the beasts and the blood all the more affecting. Yharnam is not a place designed to look like hell. It is a place designed to look like a home that has become hell, which is a harder thing to design and a more effective thing to experience. The warmth is not ironic. It is evidence of something that was real before it was destroyed. Fact 41. Many of the note-like items scattered throughout Yharnam, particularly the torn-apart notes and similar documents, are written in a mix of academic and religious register that tells you something about who was writing them. They blend the language of scholarly observation with the language of prayer and devotion, which is consistent with the healing church having absorbed Byrgenwerth's academic tradition into a religious framework. The notes do not read like the writings of purely rational scientists, nor do they read like purely religious texts. They read like the writings of people who have convinced themselves that science and faith are pointing toward the same thing, which in Bloodborne's world they arguably are. The tragedy is that being right about that in no way protected them from what it meant. Fact 42. The lecture building, which is an optional area accessible via specific items late in the game, is literally a section of Byrgenwerth University that has been transposed into the Hunter's Nightmare, a separate reality maintained by the moon presence or adjacent forces. The fact that a university building exists inside a nightmare suggests either that the nightmare deliberately pulled it there, or that the building was caught up in whatever event caused the nightmare to form. Inside, Byrgenwerth students, in various stages of transformation and mindless wandering, populate the hallways, and notes scattered around reveal research that connects Byrgenwerth's academic work to the events that precipitated the nightmare. It is one of Bloodborne's most effectively eerie locations. Something happened here that was bad enough to catch a building in it. Fact 43. The choir, the upper echelon of the healing church, operated out of a building called the Orphanage in the Upper Cathedral Ward. The name of their base of operations is itself revealing. The orphanage is called an orphanage because children were brought there, children without families who could ask questions or make demands. The choir used these children in experiments designed to induce contact with the Great Ones, based on the theory that children are more perceptually open than adults, and therefore better suited to receiving transmissions from outer entities. The horror of this is something the game presents obliquely through item descriptions and architectural evidence, rather than explicit narrative. The choir's work is never shown, only its results are. Fact 44. The Celestial Emissary boss, one of the more unusual encounters in the game, is found in the Upper Cathedral Ward area and is essentially a mass of small alien-like creatures that coalesce into one larger form. These creatures are described as being related to the Great Ones, and their presence in a church-controlled area strongly implies the choir was cultivating them deliberately, likely as a way of maintaining proximity to Great One energy or as an experiment in communication. The emissary creatures are docile and oddly childlike in their base form, which makes the boss fight, where they merge into something large and aggressive, feel more like a panicked response to being attacked than an act of aggression. They were not weapons. They became weapons because someone threatened them. Fact 45. The orphanage's interior design is one of the most deliberate in the game. The rooms are clinical and cold, the furniture sparse, and the overall atmosphere is institutional rather than domestic, consistent with a building that was called an orphanage but functioned as a laboratory. The contrast between the exterior, which fits the Gothic church architecture around it and looks like an appropriate part of the cathedral complex, and the interior, which feels more like a Victorian asylum or medical facility, is a piece of visual storytelling about what the church hid behind its ornate facade. Every institution in Bloodborne has this gap between exterior and interior. The orphanage's gap is the widest. Fact 46. One of the strangest items in Bloodborne is the umbilical cord, specifically the 1/3 of umbilical cord that can be found in multiple locations throughout the game. These items, when consumed, increase your insight and are directly connected to the game's true ending. An umbilical cord in this context is not a conventional biological artifact, but something closer to a relic, a remnant of a connection between a great one and a child born of their influence. Consuming 3 of them before fighting the final boss causes the moon presence to appear after defeating Yharnam, which triggers the game's most agentic ending. The fact that the ritual requires you to eat them is intentionally visceral. The power is real. The method is not comfortable. The game never apologizes for that. Fact 47. The lantern-lit alleys of Yharnam occasionally contain small figures called messengers, small creature-like beings with hands reaching upward that appear throughout the game, delivering items and guiding the player. Their nature is one of those things Bloodborne hints at without fully explaining. They are described as inhabitants of the dream, suggesting they belong to the same metaphysical space as the hunter's dream. Their eagerness to help, their small size, and their habit of appearing in dark places holding things up for you to take gives them an oddly touching quality, something small and earnest, trying to be useful in a world it cannot comprehend. They are not threatening. In a game where almost everything is threatening, their harmlessness is one of the most disarming things in it. Fact 48. The Eileen the Crow NPC is a hunter specifically tasked with hunting other hunters who have lost their sanity and become a danger to others. Her questline involves protecting her from another NPC hunter named Henrik, and then again from a hunter called the Bloody Crow of Canehurst, and it is one of the most rewarding optional questlines in the game. Her armour is covered in black feathers, and her weapons are designed for close quarters, fast combat. When she defeats an enemy, she performs a gesture that is both businesslike and ritualistic, acknowledging what was done and moving on. She is arguably one of the most complete character portraits in Bloodborne, a hunter who understands exactly what she does and why it is necessary and feels no joy in it whatsoever. Fact 49. The weapon known as the threaded cane is one of the more thematically interesting starting weapons in the game. It is a cane that conceals a whip, reflecting the duality of Yharnam's upper class, the surface of civility with violence just beneath. The people of Yharnam went to church in their finest clothes and used blood ministration the way one might go to a spa. The threaded cane is, in a way, a symbol of that entire social pretense, something that looks proper and refined but is designed for damage. The transformation mechanic of Bloodborne's trick weapons is one of the game's best design ideas, and the threaded cane might be its most thematically resonant example. What it is and what it does are completely different things, and neither description is wrong. Fact 50. Yharnam, for all its horror, is not described by its residents as a terrible place before the hunt begins. The people who speak to you through locked doors, the ones who have not yet turned and who are trying to wait out the night, describe the city with a kind of weary pride. Gilbert speaks of his pilgrimage as something meaningful. Even the hostile mob residents, who you can briefly attempt to reason with at the start of the game before they attack, are not villains. They are frightened people with torches in a city that is burning. Yharnam works as a horror setting precisely because it earns your sympathy before it destroys everything that warranted it. You do not hate this place, you grieve it, which is worse. Chapter 2. The Hunt and the hunters. Fact 51. The hunter protagonist of Bloodborne, the character you play as, is referred to only as the hunter, and their backstory is deliberately minimal. You are an outsider who came to Yharnam and signed a contract with Gehrman, the first hunter, before the game begins. The nature of that contract is not fully explained at the start, but the ending of the game reveals it to be a binding agreement that ties your soul to the hunter's dream for as long as the dream exists. The fact that you sign a contract before you're fully aware of what that contract means is a direct reference to how the blood administration system works, and how Yharnam traps the people who come to it. The city's most consistent feature is that it offers something you want, and then explains the terms after the transaction is complete. Fact 52. The hunter's dream, the safe hub area where the player upgrades weapons and communes with the doll, exists in a separate reality from Yharnam. It is maintained by the Moon Presence, who uses it to cultivate hunters as tools. Gehrman, who tends the dream and provides guidance to each new hunter, has been trapped there for an enormous length of time, and his age and evident exhaustion at the start of the game suggest the dream is not a pleasant place to be, regardless of how it appears. The garden is beautiful and the workshop is functional, but Gehrman sits in his wheelchair in the garden looking like someone who gave up on a very specific hope a very long time ago and has not found a reason to replace it. Fact 53. The doll in the hunter's dream is one of Bloodborne's most discussed and theorized characters. She is a porcelain doll that Gehrman built, and that has somehow been given life within the dream. She is warm and gentle in her interactions and performs the leveling mechanic by taking your blood echoes and transforming them into stat upgrades. Her origin is tied to Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower, one of the DLC's central characters, whom Gehrman loved and after whom he modelled the doll. The complexity here is that the doll is not Maria, is aware she's not Maria, and seems to have developed her own sense of self within the dream, despite being a constructed facsimile. She is Gehrman's grief given a body. She has become more than that on her own. Fact 54. Blood echoes, the currency and experience system in Bloodborne, are described as the vestiges of the hunt, the remnants of life force left behind when something dies. When you absorb blood echoes from a fallen enemy, you are literally consuming what is left of that creature's life, its memories, its vitality, its being reduced to transferable energy. When you die and lose your blood echoes, the lore implication is that those remnants are drifting in the world until you reclaim them. When another player kills your blood echo remnant in multiplayer, those echoes are gone entirely. The blood echo system is one of those game mechanics that becomes more disturbing the more you think about what it represents. Every level you gain is built from the compressed remnants of everything that died for you. Fact 55. The trick weapon system is one of Bloodborne's most celebrated design innovations. Unlike the prior Souls games, which use conventional melee and shield setups, Bloodborne gives every weapon two forms that can be switched in real time during combat. The transformations are not just visual. Each form has different movesets, different ranges, and different damage properties, and many have built-in gameplay synergies where transforming mid-combo extends attack chains or adds damage. The mechanical justification in the lore is that hunters designed their weapons to be adaptable for fighting both humans and beasts, but the deeper reason is that it is one of the most satisfying combat systems From Software has ever built. The weapon does not just kill, it adapts to what needs killing. Fact 56. The hunter's pistol, which serves as the main firearm at the start of the game, is described as a converted medical instrument. In Yharnam, medical tools and weapons share design language, which is consistent with the city's dual identity as a place of healing and a place of extreme violence. The syringe-like design elements visible on some of the starting pistols reinforce the idea that Yharnam's hunters were originally closer to medical professionals than soldiers, people who used the tools of the healing trade, but turned them toward combat as the beast problem escalated beyond what conventional medicine could manage. The gun that kills beasts was first designed to treat patients. That transition tells you everything about how the institution evolved. Fact 57. Alfred, the first hunter NPC you encounter in Cathedral Ward, is a member of the Executioners faction, the group dedicated to hunting the vile bloods. He is cheerful, helpful, and surprisingly earnest, which makes his eventual fate one of the most affecting in the game. If you follow his questline, he eventually hunts down Queen Annalise of the Vile Bloods and executes her, fulfilling the oath he made to Ligarius. But the execution, as shown, is an act of extraordinary and excessive violence that goes far beyond what the executioner's stated purpose would require. His cheerfulness curdled into something ugly by the time he reaches his goal. It is one of Bloodborne's quieter observations about what happens to a person when their whole identity is built around a mission, and the mission is finally complete. Fact 58. The weapon, called the Kirkhammer, is associated with the Church Hunters and uses a sword that can transform into an enormous stone hammer. The hammer portion is effectively a miniature architectural fragment, a chunk of the kind of stonework you would find in a church building. The implication is that these weapons were improvised or adapted from available materials, that church hunters, in an emergency, would use whatever was at hand, including pieces of the buildings they were defending, or alternatively, that someone decided the best weapon against the abominations of the night was a piece of the sacred structure itself. The cathedral's stones do not just contain the church; in the hands of a hunter, they become it. Fact 59. Gehrman's backstory, pieced together from multiple sources, including the burial blade weapon description, his dialogue, the DLC's revelations, and the architecture of the hunter's dream, suggests he was once one of Byrgenwerth's most talented students. He became the first hunter, developed the trick weapon combat style that all subsequent hunters use, and trained the first generation of Yharnam's hunters. At some point he made the arrangement with the moon presence that bound him to the dream, and he has been there ever since, watching hunters cycle through, helping them, and waiting for the chance to die. His burial blade weapon description says it belongs to a man who has accepted death, which tells you exactly who Gehrman is before you ever learn his backstory. The blade is his autobiography. Fact 60. The hunter runes carved into certain weapons and items in Bloodborne are not just mechanical modifiers. They are described as discoveries made by Carol, a Byrgenwerth student who could hear the frenzied screams of the Great Ones and transcribe what she heard into written symbols. The idea that runes in Bloodborne are not invented but received, that they are phonetic transcriptions of something a human heard from a god, reframes how the game's upgrade system works. When you equip a rune that increases your stamina or decreases your damage taken, you are essentially inscribing your character with words spoken by something from beyond the observable universe. The upgrade system is a tattoo parlor stocked with divine utterances. Fact 61. The Nightmare Frontier and the Nightmare of Mensis are two nightmare realms accessible during the game, and they are structurally similar but thematically different. The Nightmare Frontier appears to be an older, less organised nightmare, a place where things accumulate rather than a place built for a purpose. The Nightmare of Mensis is more deliberate, created or at least used by the Mensis scholars in their attempt to contact and capture a Great One. The Mensis nightmare contains a hanging doll of enormous scale, the Murgo's wet nurse boss, and the screaming infant that is Murgo, which the scholars were attempting to keep or study. It is one of the most uncomfortable spaces in the game once you understand what it was built to do and what it ended up containing. Fact 62. The pebble items in Bloodborne have a description that reads as a commentary on the fundamental inadequacy of trying to distract something ancient and powerful with trivial gestures. Mechanically, pebbles are used to draw enemy attention, but item descriptions in Bloodborne often carry lore weight, and the description of the pebble implies it is something a hunter uses when they have nothing better to offer, a small stone thrown at a darkness that is not going to be fooled by it for long. Whether or not that reading was intended by the writers, it fits the game's theme so precisely that it feels worth noting. The pebble is the hunter's honest acknowledgement of how outmatched they are. Fact 63. The Grave Guard set, a piece of hunter armor found in certain areas of the game, belongs to a category of equipment associated with hunters who specialized in protecting graveyards and burial sites. In the context of Yharnam, where the dead do not stay dead, and where certain burial rites may have been altered by exposure to the old blood, a graveyard guardian has a very different job description than the conventional one. The armor set suggests a whole category of hunter activity that the game never explicitly shows, the quiet and unglamorous work of making sure the dead remained so. In Yharnam, that work would have been constant, thankless, and eventually futile. Fact 64. The church pick weapon, introduced in the Old Hunters DLC, has a description suggesting it was originally a medical tool used to administer blood ministration, a large needle-like instrument used to inject patients. Its transformation into a weapon, specifically a whip in one form, reflects the transformation of the church itself from a healing institution into something more martial and coercive. The church pick is not a weapon designed in advance for violence, but a medical implement that was repurposed when the work of the church required a different kind of point. The history of the weapon is the history of the institution it came from, summarized in a transformation you can trigger with the press of a button. Fact 65. The saw cleaver, arguably the most iconic starting weapon in Bloodborne, and many players' weapon of choice for their first playthrough, is described in its item text as a type of weapon commonly used by hunters before more sophisticated designs became available. The saw mechanism in the transformed state increases damage against beasts because the serrated edge tears rather than cuts, inflicting more tissue damage. This mechanical detail is embedded in the weapon's lore description, and it says something interesting about the game design philosophy, that even the most basic weapon in the game has a reason for existing beyond convention. It is not the simplest weapon because it was the first thing the developers built. It is the simplest weapon because the lore requires something that came before elegance. Fact 66. Simon the Harrowed, an NPC encountered in the Hunter's Nightmare section of the DLC, is one of the most layered characters in the entire game. He came to the nightmare to find a way to end it, which suggests both that he knows the nightmare is causing harm in the waking world and that he believes it can be stopped. His weapon, the bowblade, is unusual and elegant, and his dialogue is careful and slightly guarded, as if he has decided to trust you provisionally and is watching to see if he made the right call. His questline involves following you through the nightmare while providing contextual information about the DLC's characters and history. His fate, which depends on player choices, has one of the most melancholy outcomes in a game full of them. Fact 67. The Hunter's Nightmare itself, the realm where the DLC primarily takes place, is described as a place where hunters who committed sins during the hunt are sent after death. But the nature of sin in Bloodborne is complicated. The hunters who ended up in the nightmare were not necessarily evil in any conventional sense. Many of them were following church directives or responding to a situation they did not fully understand. The nightmare is less a punishment designed by a moral arbiter and more a consequence of specific events involving Kos and the fishing hamlet, a wound in reality that keeps bleeding because the original injury was never properly addressed. The nightmare does not punish, it persists. That is its nature. Fact 68. The Valter NPC, who leads the League, a faction of hunters dedicated to consuming the vermin that the League believes infest the world, is one of the game's stranger optional characters. The vermin that League members can see, and that Valta eats are tiny worm-like creatures visible only to those with enough insight or those who have been initiated into the League's specific perceptual frame. Whether these vermin are real, a form of shared hallucination, or something the Moon Presence or another entity is using to manipulate hunters into specific behaviours is left entirely open. Valta himself eventually succumbs and transforms, which suggests whatever the League was doing carried its own risks, regardless of whether what they were hunting was real. Fact 69. The Chikagi weapon associated with Canehurst and the Vilebloods is one of the more mechanically interesting weapons in the game because it damages you while transformed. In the transformed state, the Chikage drains blood from the wielder and adds it to the blade, increasing its power. The item description says the blade thirsts for blood, which in the context of Bloodborne's world is not necessarily metaphorical. Vile blood has properties that make it attractive to certain weapons and entities, and the Chikagi's transformation mechanic can be read as the blade literally feeding on the user to power itself. Equipping a weapon that hurts you is one of Bloodborne's more elegant ways of encoding lore into mechanics. The cost is not hidden, it is built in. Fact 70. The Hunter Covenant system in Bloodborne, which involves aligning yourself with factions like the Vilebloods, or the Hunters of Hunters, or the League, is less mechanically emphasized than in the prior Souls games, but more narratively interesting. Each faction has a specific worldview and a specific relationship to the blood, the beasts, and the Great Ones. Joining a covenant is less a game mechanic and more a statement about where your hunter falls in Yharnam's moral landscape. The covenants do not tell you what to believe. They reveal what you already chose to believe by offering a framework that fits. The choice is less about mechanics and more about what kind of story you want to have been a part of. Fact 71. The gravestone inscriptions throughout Yharnam contain text that is partially legible in certain areas, and community researchers have noted that the inscriptions contain fragments of names and dates that partially reconstruct a history of Yharnam predating the game's events. Some graves appear to belong to hunters who died in previous purges of Old Yharnam. Others have dates so old they predate the Healing Church's founding, suggesting either that the graveyard was used before the current city existed, or that some graves were placed retroactively for commemorative rather than interment purposes. The graveyard is a record, but it is a record that has been edited by whoever managed it. Some things were remembered, others were quietly removed. Fact 72. The Gatling gun, one of the more unusual weapons in Bloodborne's otherwise precise arsenal, is found in a very specific location, associated with a very specific storyline. It was used by a hunter of considerable size and strength, and its placement suggests it was not a standard issue hunter weapon, but something built or acquired for a specific purpose. Its unwieldy nature in combat, the long startup time, and difficulty in aiming accurately makes it a weapon for situations where precision is less important than sustained volume of fire, which tells you something about what the hunter who wielded it was up against. They were not fighting a thing. They were fighting many things, continuously, for a very long time. Fact 73. The Powder Keg Hunters, a faction referred to in several DLC weapon descriptions, were a group known for using unconventional, explosive, and improvised weapons. They were viewed with disapproval by the official Healing Church hunting apparatus, which preferred more controlled and precise methods. The DLC introduces several of their signature weapons, including the Whirligig Saw and the Boom Hammer, both of which are aggressively impractical in design, and both of which are extremely effective at their intended purpose. The Powder Keg's apparent disregard for conventional hunting protocol makes them one of the game's most endearing background factions. They looked at the problem, looked at what the church was doing, and decided there had to be a better approach involving significantly more fire. Fact 74. The Morning Star weapon, a spiked flail, carries item description text referencing its use in both combat and ecclesiastical punishment. which tells you something about the healing church's justice system. The fact that church-affiliated weapons include flagellation tools speaks to the institution's medieval roots and its belief in physical mortification as a form of spiritual discipline. The church is not simply a healing organization with military ambitions. It is a fully realized religious institution with a theology, a judicial system, and a set of punishments for those who violate its laws. The Morning Star was used on enemies and on the church's own members, which is a distinction the institution apparently did not consider significant. Fact 75. The Clawmark rune, one of the runes that hunters can equip, increases visceral attack damage and is described as a rune representing the desire to sink one's fingers into a beast. The visceral attack system in Bloodborne, where parrying an enemy with a well-timed gunshot allows you to perform a devastating finishing move, is mechanically one of the game's most rewarding systems. But the rune that enhances it is described in terms of desire and tactile violence, which repositions the parry and finish combo not as discipline technique, but as something more primal. It suggests that the line between the hunter and the beast is thinner than the hunter would like to believe. The best hunters know that. The worst ones find out. Fact 76. The Canehurst coachman, who drives the spectral carriage that takes you to Canehurst Castle, is never explained. He appears when you hold the Canehurst summons, drives you through a blizzard on a road that should not exist, and deposits you at the castle without a word. He does not wait for you. He is not there when you try to return. The carriage he drives is described visually in terms that suggest it belongs to a different era than the current Yharnam, possibly predating the healing church entirely. He is one of those Bloodborne characters who exists in the negative space of the lore, present only as an implication of what the world used to be. The coach arrives because something remembers that it should. Fact 77. The Wolf's Pledge rune is associated with the Canehurst Vilebloods and represents the covenant between the Vileblood Queen and her night hunters. The word wolf in a game about a beast plague is interesting because wolves are the most culturally loaded of beast transformations, the one most associated, in folklore, with the transition between human and inhuman. The Vilebloods being associated with wolf imagery rather than the more randomly transformed beasts of the main game positions them as something more deliberate and controlled in their relationship with their non-human natures. They did not fall into this, they chose it, and they organized themselves around having chosen it, which makes them a different kind of thing than anything else in the game. Fact 78. The Formless Odin rune is named for the Great One Odin, who is described as formless and existing as a voice rather than a physical form. Uidon is the only Great One in the game explicitly associated with sound and speech rather than sight. Multiple characters in Yharnam are described as chanters or speakers in Uidon's service, including the Uidonwraith worshippers in the chapel and the creatures associated with his presence throughout the game. The rune named after Uidon increases the number of bullets you carry, which in the context of the game's blood bullet mechanic, where bullets are literally drawn from your own blood, ties Uidon's formlessness to the act of giving yourself up for a resource. He is the god of offering something of yourself without being asked to explain why. Fact 79. The Hunter's Mark, the rune associated with awakening and resurrection, is the game's fundamental metaphysical mechanic made visible. When you die and return to your last lamp, the story told is that the Hunter's Mark brings you back because you are bound to the dream. The mark itself appears as a simple symbol but carries the weight of the entire covenant with the moon presence. The game does not dwell on what it means to die and return, whether the hunter who comes back is the same as the one who died, whether memories persist or degrade across multiple deaths. These are questions the game raises and then leaves entirely to the player to sit with, which is exactly where they belong. Fact 80. The Saw Hunter badge is one of the items that unlocks purchases at the Bath Messengers. the small messenger run shops where you buy weapons and items. The badge belonged to an early hunter whose approach to the hunt emphasized brutal efficiency over elegance, and finding the badge lets you purchase the weapons associated with that philosophy. The badge system in general is a way of unlocking access to the knowledge and tools of hunters who came before you, as if the equipment of a dead hunter can be distributed to those who come after as a kind of inheritance. The dead do not stop contributing to the hunt. Their tools outlast them and find new hands. Fact 81. Henrik, a hunter you can encounter and must fight as part of Eileen the Crow's questline, is described as a long-serving hunter who hunted alongside Gascoigne for years before the current night. He's wearing the same attire as Gascoigne, and the two of them being outfitted the same way suggests they were either partners in a formal hunter pairing or belonged to the same specific unit. His aggression toward the player makes more sense in the context of Eileen's explanation that he has lost his sanity, but unlike many sanity-lost hunters, Henrik is clearly still a skilled combatant. The muscle memory of hunting is the last thing to go. He has lost the reason for the skill. The skill itself remains. Fact 82. The Tempering Blood Gemstone, a blood gem used to enhance weapon damage, is one of the most common and sought-after upgrade materials in the game. Blood gems are, according to their descriptions, crystallized remnants of the blood that flows through beasts and certain supernatural beings. When you insert a blood gem into a weapon, you are literally embedding a fragment of transformed blood into the weapon to enhance its killing power. The upgrade system of Bloodborne is, in its lore underpinning, a record of everything that has been killed and processed in Yharnam's long history. Every weapon upgrade is a small monument to a specific death. The most powerful weapons are the ones that have been upgraded the most. Fact 83. The Old Hunter Bone is a consumable item in Bloodborne that, when used, temporarily accelerates the hunter's movements to a speed associated with hunters of old. The description says the bone contains the essence of a hunter who, through long practice, moved so quickly it left an impression in their very skeleton. The concept that a skill practiced intensely enough can become physically encoded in the body is present in several ways throughout Bloodborne's lore, and the Old Hunter Bone is one of the more direct expressions of it. You are not using a tool. You are borrowing a dead person's muscle memory, and for a brief window, it is yours. When it expires, the skill goes back to where it came from. Fact 84. The Ailing Loran Chalice is one of the Chalice dungeon rituals that leads into the Loran dungeons, a subset of the Thumerian labyrinth, containing some of the most difficult enemies and interesting lore fragments in the game. Loran is described as a lost land that was consumed by the Scourge of Beasts before Yharnam, meaning the same plague currently destroying Yharnam already destroyed an entire civilization elsewhere. The Sandy Brightstone, an item found in Loran, is described as containing the remnants of that land, which transforms it from a simple, consumable, into a pocket-sized monument to something that was entirely annihilated. Yharnam is not the first. Loran tells you that with complete indifference. Fact 85. The Madman garb, set worn by certain enemies in the Chalice dungeons, represents what happens to scholars and researchers who go too deep into the Thumerian ruins without adequate preparation. The madmen are not simply insane. They have been exposed to levels of Great One influence that have broken their ability to process reality normally, but they have not been consumed entirely. They wander the dungeons in a state of acute suffering, retaining just enough cognitive function to be pathetic rather than simply monstrous. The madman enemies are the Bloodborne equivalent of tragedy as an enemy type. Killing them is the most merciful option, which means every fight with one is a kind of mercy that nobody asked you to perform. Fact 86. The Executioners faction had a specific ritual involving the collection of heads, specifically the heads of vile bloods, which they offered to Ligarius as trophies of the hunt. The Wheel Hunter badge, associated with the Executioners, gives you access to the Ligarius wheel weapon, a weapon designed to be used by executioners and one of the more theatrical and brutally physical weapons in the game. The wheel is consecrated and can be enhanced with arcane power. The act of crushing enemies with a spinning wheel of sacred architecture is exactly the kind of violent spectacle that a faction like the Executioners would design around its ideology. The punishment must be seen to be believed. The believing is the point. Fact 87. The Beast Claw weapon, one of the more unusual options in the game's arsenal, is literally a weapon made from the severed limb of a beast. Equipping it causes the hunter to fight with their fists in a way that increasingly mimics beast movement patterns, and certain runes associated with the weapon describe the user as gradually adopting beast behavior over prolonged use. The weapon is a direct expression of the game's most persistent thematic question, which is how much of the beast you can use before the distinction between you and it stops being meaningful. Most trick weapons imply that question obliquely. The Beast Claw states it plainly. You are not wielding something that belonged to the enemy. You are becoming something the enemy would recognize. Fact 88. The Rifle Spear, one of the more mechanically unusual weapons in the game, combines a thrusting spear with an embedded firearm in a way that is never fully explained beyond its being a hunter weapon. Its design implies a specific problem it was built to solve: the need to keep a beast at distance while still delivering a decisive blow, which tells you something about the kinds of beasts it was designed for. The spear end suggests something that needed to be kept away. The gun end suggests something that could not be kept away for long. Whoever built this weapon was solving a very specific problem repeatedly, and eventually decided to solve both halves of it simultaneously. Fact 89. The Spark Hunter badge, which unlocks the Tonitrus and Bolt paper, is associated with a specific type of hunter who specialized in using electricity against beasts. The item descriptions for lightning-type blood gems and electric weapons suggest that certain beasts have a physiological vulnerability to electricity, which the Healing Church eventually catalogued and incorporated into hunter equipment. The fact that a specific badge is associated with this specialization suggests there was enough demand for electric weaponry to warrant a dedicated hunter category. Yharnam's beast problem was varied enough and persistent enough that hunters began to specialize, which means the church knew the problem was not going away and started optimizing around it. Fact 90. The Executioner's gloves, an arcane scaling trick weapon found in the game, fire-seeking projectiles resembling the wheel of the Executioners. They are unusual because they are classified as a weapon, but function more like a ranged spell, a category of combat the game does not heavily feature. Their presence suggests that certain church hunters operated at a level of arcane knowledge that blurred the line between what we would call a weapon and what we would call a ritual. The gloves throw consecrated fire, shaped like sacred symbols, which is either an extremely sophisticated technological achievement or a very specific kind of prayer that happens to kill things. In Bloodborne's world, the distinction is not as clear as it would be elsewhere. Fact 91. The Bloodletter weapon, associated with the Ailing Lauren Chalice dungeons, and with a very specific hunter whose armor set accompanies it, involves impaling the user through the palm to transform. It is one of the most viscerally uncomfortable transformation animations in the game, and it is clearly designed to be. The hunter who wielded this weapon had decided at some point that the best way to fight the thing inside them was to let it out in a controlled and weaponized direction. The Bloodletter is not a sword that happens to hurt you. It is a methodology of managed self-destruction used as a fence. The cost is the point. You cannot swing this weapon while pretending the cost is not real. Fact 92. The Hunter of Hunters Covenant, led by Eileen the Crow, serves a function that the rest of Yharnam's institutional hunter apparatus could never serve, which is acknowledging that hunters themselves become dangers. Every other faction assumes that hunters are assets to be directed. The hunter of hunters assumes that hunters will eventually break and need to be put down, and builds a specific role around that assumption. This is either the most honest thing any institution in Bloodborne ever did, or the most pessimistic, depending on how you read it. Eileen does not think the hunt corrupts all hunters. She thinks it corrupts enough of them that someone needs to be watching, and she decided to be that someone. Fact 93. The empty phantasm. Shell consumable, which adds arcane damage to a weapon temporarily, is described as the shed casing of a creature from the outer realms. The fact that something from beyond the normal world passed through here and left a shell behind is treated in the item description with scientific detachment, as if finding cosmological detritus scattered across a hunting ground is simply an occupational detail that hunters learn to catalogue and use. The shell is empty, whatever was in it left. The item's casual framing of that fact says a great deal about how hunters in Bloodborne's world eventually relate to the impossible. It does not stop being impossible. You just stop having the energy to be surprised by it. Fact 94. The pungent blood cocktail, used to lure beasts with the scent of blood, has an item description that implies hunters learned beast behaviour patterns well enough to exploit their instincts systematically. There is something quietly unsettling about a tool designed around the premise that you understand your enemy well enough to predict exactly what will make them abandon rationality and chase a smell. The hunter who developed this item spent enough time around beasts to map their instincts. The map they made is accurate. The accuracy required proximity that most people would not have survived, which means the knowledge cost something before it was useful. Fact 95. The Nightmare Apostle enemies in the Nightmare of Mensis are spider-like creatures that appear throughout the nightmare's outer walls and ceilings. Their design is consistent with the spider imagery associated with Rom, the vacuous spider, one of the game's mid-boss great ones. The connection suggests that Rom's influence or presence has shaped the nightmare itself at a biological or metaphysical level, or that the creatures that exist in proximity to a great one gradually come to resemble that great one's nature. The nightmare is not a neutral space. It reflects what lives in it. Everything there has been changed by the thing at its centre, and the spider shapes on the walls are the nightmare showing you what it contains before you find it yourself. Fact 96. The old hunter Henrik's set has an item description, noting that Henrik was known for his extraordinary longevity as a hunter, surviving far longer than hunters normally do. The reason for this longevity is not fully explained, but it is implied to be related to the blood, and specifically to a particular relationship with the old blood that either preserves or prevents the kind of deterioration that kills most hunters. His survival is not presented as a gift. By the time you encounter him, it reads as a kind of trap. He outlived the thing that gave him purpose and kept going by instinct, which is close enough to beast behaviour that the distinction may not be worth maintaining. Fact 97. The guidance rune, one of the more philosophically interesting runes in the game, is described as representing the will to remember the master's teaching and strive to become a true hunter. The rune is associated with the deep appreciation for the hunting craft that the best hunters developed. But the word guidance points toward the fundamental structure of how hunters operated, always in relationship to someone who taught them, always organised around transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. The hunt is passed down. The rune that encodes this value is also the one that enhances rally. The mechanic where attacking immediately after taking damage lets you recover health. Even the most abstract value in Bloodborne has a fighting application. Fact 98. The bone ash set, worn by hunters associated with the old Yharnam purge, is fire-resistant and described as belonging to hunters who used fire as a primary weapon against the beasts. The purge of old Yharnam involved burning the entire district, a decision made at the church level and carried out by hunters who were trained specifically for that operation. The bone ash armor suggests those hunters expected to be inside the fire, not simply throwing it. They were not burning the city from a safe distance. They were in the streets with it, close enough to need protection from the thing they were doing, which is one of those details that reframes what the purge of old Yharnam actually looked like at ground level. Fact 99. The impurity rune, associated with the League of Hunters, represents the belief that all living things are infected with a kind of moral or spiritual filth that the League's hunters can perceive and remove. The rune is described as belonging to those who dedicate themselves to the hunt as a form of purification, rather than simply as a job. The League is the game's most explicitly zealous faction, and the impurity rune is the mechanical expression of that zealotry. When you equip it, you are making a philosophical statement about what you think the hunt is for. The statement is extreme. The rune does not soften it. It just puts a number on it. Fact 100. The 100th fact in a list about Bloodborne feels like a point to pause on the game's central, emotional register, which is grief. Every major character in Bloodborne has lost something. Yharnam lost Maria, and then his freedom. Eileen lost her belief in hunters as reliable instruments. Alfred lost his mentor, and then lost himself fulfilling what his mentor started. The hunter loses their memory, their waking life, their mortality, and eventually their humanity, depending on which ending they pursue. The game is not about horror in the sense of fear. It is about horror in the sense of watching something that mattered fall apart from the inside, which is a different kind of horror and a harder one to shake. Bloodborne stays with people because it makes you love the thing before it shows you what happened to it. Chapter 3. The Great Ones and the Cosmos at 101. The Great Ones are not gods in the conventional religious sense. They do not create, sustain, or govern the world. They exist alongside it, adjacent to it, drawn toward it by specific properties it possesses. Their relationship with humanity is not one of worship and protection, but of proximity and consequence. Humans seek contact with Great Ones because that contact produces insight and transformation. Great Ones appear drawn to humanity because humanity can produce something the Great Ones cannot, which is children, heirs, continuation. The entire cosmological tragedy of Bloodborne is built on this asymmetry. Humanity wants transcendence. The Great Ones want something far more ordinary, and the gap between those two desires is where every catastrophe in the game originates. Fact 102. The Moon Presence, the entity that maintains the hunter's dream and collects hunters as tools, is the primary antagonist of the base game, even though it is only visible in one specific ending. Its influence is present throughout the entire game in the form of the dream itself, the lamp system, the cycle of hunts, and Yharnam's imprisonment. The Moon Presence wants hunters who have consumed enough blood echoes and gained enough insight to be useful to it, and the dream is the mechanism by which it recruits, trains, and maintains those hunters. The entity at the top of the game's cosmological hierarchy is running what amounts to a very elaborate and very old employment scheme, and the employees do not fully understand the terms of their contracts. Fact 103. Mergo, the infant Great One, or Great One, adjacent entity whose cries permeate the nightmare of Mensis, is already dead by the events of the game. Its mother, implied to be Yharnam, the Thumerian queen, lost it during birth or shortly after, and the nightmare persists because the infant's death was never properly mourned or acknowledged. The wet nurse is the boss guarding Mergo, not as an offensive measure, but as a caretaker, still tending to something that is no longer there. The nightmare's persistence is not a military or metaphysical defense. It is grief that has become structural. The Mensis scholars trapped themselves in a nightmare that was already inconsolable before they arrived. Fact 104. Rom, the vacuous spider, is described as a scholar of Bergenwerth, who is elevated to a Great One status through the act of gaining too much knowledge. She's found in the Moonside Lake, a beautiful and tranquil location that is one of the most visually striking areas in the game. Her name, the vacuous spider, refers to a quality of emptiness or blankness, which is described in some interpretations as the specific kind of mercy that comes from knowing too much. Rom knows what is happening in Yharnam. The illusion she maintains, which conceals the blood moon from those who have not yet advanced far enough, is a kindness of ignorance rather than a deception of malice. She is hiding the truth, the way you cover a wound you cannot treat. Fact 105. The celestial children, enemies found near the Moonside Lake, are small and passive until provoked, and their designs closely resemble the messengers that assist the player throughout the game. The similarity in design between the messengers and the celestial children is one of those visual rhymes Bloodborne uses to suggest things without stating them. Both are small, both are associated with the boundary between ordinary reality and the outer reaches of the game's cosmology, and both seem fundamentally non-aggressive until the situation forces otherwise. The implication is that the messengers and the celestial children are related at some deep structural level, which raises questions about exactly what kind of entities the messengers are and what their continued helpfulness toward the hunter actually represents. Fact 106. Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos, is a great one, found in the upper cathedral ward who the healing church was apparently sheltering and studying. She is one of the few great ones in the game that has an explicit relationship with the church, and that relationship appears to have been collaborative rather than purely exploitative. Ebrietas did not come to be in the cathedral by accident. The church brought her there or created the conditions for her to remain because she was a direct source of knowledge and power. Her boss fight is one of the most difficult in the game, and her size and the luminescent properties of her body give her a strange, almost mournful quality. She's in a place she chose to be in, surrounded by things that are no longer there. Fact 107. The concept of insight in Bloodborne is one of the most interesting game mechanics ever developed, because it changes the game at the level of reality. As your insight increases, new enemies appear, existing enemies gain new behaviours, NPC dialogue changes, and the fundamental texture of the world shifts. Mechanically, high insight decreases your beasthood stat, making you less susceptible to beast transformation, but more susceptible to frenzy, the madness-inducing effect associated with contact with great ones. The balance being proposed is not between good and bad options. It is between two kinds of destruction. The beast wants your body. The great ones want what is behind your eyes. Fact 108. The brain of Mensis, the enormous mass of neural tissue found in the nightmare, and visible through a large window in the nightmare of Mensis, is one of the most unsettling enemies in the game. It is not a conventional boss, but a passive entity that inflicts frenzy simply by being looked at. The fact that the most effective way to defeat it is to not look at it is a perfect piece of mechanical storytelling. The Mensis scholars surgically removed their own brains and replaced them with this thing, or used it as a kind of uplink to communicate with the Great Ones. The result is an entity that is partially composed of human minds, and that destroys human minds by being perceived. It is the cost of the experiment made into a thing that sits in a cage and looks at you. Fact 109. The abandoned old workshop, found via a secret drop in the cathedral ward area, contains a plain doll figure that appears to be an early or unfinished version of the doll in the hunter's dream. Its presence in the waking world suggests that Gehrman built the physical doll there before the dream existed, or before the dream became what it is now. The workshop is one of the most emotionally affecting optional areas in the game because it tells you that everything in the dream, including the doll, began as something real and human, made by a grieving person who wanted to preserve something that was already gone. The dream is not a supernatural gift. It is a monument that someone built out of loss and then got trapped inside. Fact 110. The amygdala boss encountered in the Nightmare Frontier is the only version of those creatures that the player directly fights, while the amygdalae throughout Yharnam are only visible, not interactive. The boss amygdala's design makes its enormous size feel simultaneously ancient and vulnerable because the fight involves damaging its head and limbs, which it tears off and uses as weapons. It is a god that fights with pieces of itself. The willingness to destroy its own components to win a fight is consistent with the Great Ones, as the game presents them throughout. Entities that do not experience self-preservation the way humans do, because the self they would be preserving is not a thing they value in the same way. Fact 111. Ueden Chapel, the safe area early in the game where you can send survivors for protection, is named after the formless Great One. The chapel is one of the few places in the game where NPCs gather and remain alive, at least initially. The fact that a place named after a voiceless, formless, cosmic entity is the designated shelter in a city under siege is either an irony or a very specific piece of world building. Ueden's influence in the game is associated with blood and the act of giving, and the chapel being a gathering place for the desperate and wounded fits that association. The formless god's house is the one where the broken things collect, which may be exactly what the game intends by the placement. Fact 112. The choir's experiments were aimed at a very specific goal, which was forcing contact with the Great Ones, not through gradual exposure, but through a direct engineered communion. They used children because of the widely held belief that children's undeveloped perceptual filters made them better receivers for Great One transmissions. The specific experiments described in item lore involve exposing children to doses of formless Ueden and monitoring what happened. The Church framed this as a path to salvation and transcendence. What the item descriptions describe sounds considerably less transcendent and considerably more like the systematic destruction of minds that were not equipped for what was being put into them. Fact 113. Mikolash, host of the Nightmare, is one of the most unusual boss encounters in the game. He runs from you through the Nightmare of Mensis, shouting fragmentary philosophical statements and requests addressed to the Great Ones, until you eventually corner him and he fights in a confined space. His dialogue during the chase includes references to Coles and to Eyes on the Inside, which is one of the game's most direct articulations of the choir's perceptual philosophy. He is not frightened by the hunt. He is annoyed by the interruption. He's in the middle of something he considers important, and you have arrived at the worst possible time. His death is his last indignity in a nightmare he was already losing control of, which makes the fight feel less like a victory and more like a mercy he would not have accepted if you had offered it. Fact 114. The Orphan of Kos, the final boss of the Old Hunters DLC, is the child of the Great One Kos, born from the body of the beached Kos in the fishing hamlet. The orphan's cry at the start of the fight is one of the most memorable audio moments in the game, a raw and inconsolable sound that immediately establishes the fight's emotional register. This is not a villain. This is something that was born into a nightmare it did not create, that has never known anything except the place where it came into the world and the body of the thing that bore it. Fighting it is the culmination of everything the DLC has been building toward in terms of the hunter's guilt. The nightmare persists because of what was done to Kos. The orphan is what was done to Kos, given a body and a cry. Fact 115. The concept of eyes on the inside, repeated in multiple item descriptions and in Mikolash's dialogue, refers to a specific philosophical ideal held by the Upper Healing Church and the Mensis scholars. The theory is that true perception of the Great Ones and the cosmos requires not the literal eyes in your head, but a form of internal sight, a restructuring of consciousness that allows the mind to perceive things beyond the visible spectrum of normal experience. The physical eyes throughout Yharnam's architecture are representations of this ideal rather than literal prescriptions. The church was not saying open your eyes, it was saying become a different kind of thing that has eyes where you currently have none, which is either transcendence or destruction, depending on what happens to the person in the process. Continue from where you left off no matter what. 1804, prepared to resume enumerated list continuation. Prepared to resume enumerated list continuation. Fact 116. The Great One. Cold blood, a consumable item that grants blood echoes when used, is described as a remnant of a Great One's being, a fragment of something cosmic that has been reduced to a transferable resource. The fact that Great One essence can be bottled and spent like currency is one of Bloodborne's quieter indignities. The most powerful entities in the game's cosmology can be broken into pieces that a hunter uses to buy a slightly better weapon. The universe does not protect its most significant contents from being repurposed. Whatever a Great One was, it can become pocket change, and the game presents that without comment, because in Yharnam, that is simply a category of item. Fact 117. The Kos parasite, the weapon dropped by the Orphan of Kos, can only be used effectively with a specific rune equipped and scales with arcane in a way that makes it one of the most unusual weapons in the game mechanically. Its description says it contains the will of Kos, and that using it means being used by it in return. The weapon that comes from the final boss of the DLC is itself a relationship rather than a tool. It does not simply do what you tell it. It does what it does, and if your build accommodates that, the results are remarkable, and if it does not, the weapon is nearly useless. Kos is still making terms, even as a parasite, even as a remnant. The Great One is gone. The insistence on reciprocity remains. Fact 118. The fishing hamlet, the DLC area where Kos was found, and where the hunters committed the act that created the hunter's nightmare, is one of the most visually distinct areas in the game. It is coastal, grey, wet and populated by fishermen who've been transformed into something between human and deep-sea creature. The hamlet's residents were not participants in Björgenwerth's research. They were the site of it. Explorers arrived at their village, discovered Kos beached there, and began dissecting her while she was still alive or recently dead, harvesting her knowledge for the sake of the research project. The hamlet's residents tried to protect her. The notes scattered through the area described that resistance and how it was handled. The hunters won. What winning looked like in that village is why the nightmare exists. Fact 119. Ludwig, the Holy Blade, is the first boss of the Old Hunters DLC and one of the most structurally complex boss fights in the game. In the first phase, he is almost entirely consumed by his beast transformation, enormous and animalistic. And in the second phase, he regains partial lucidity after finding his lost weapon and fighting with renewed purpose. His final moments of dialogue, where he asks if his hunters were noble and kind before dying, are written with the specific quality of someone asking a question they need the answer to be yes to, regardless of what the answer actually is. He devoted himself entirely to the church's vision of the hunt. He needs to believe that vision was worth it. The game does not confirm or deny it. It lets you choose what to tell him. Fact 120. The Holy Moonlight Sword, Ludwig's weapon found in the DLC, is described as a weapon that has been passed down through hunters who recognized its power and its connection to the Great Ones. It is one of the most famous weapons in the Souls and Bloodborne series, appearing in various forms across multiple From Software games, and its placement here as Ludwig's weapon ties the game to a broader mythology without requiring familiarity with that mythology. The sword glows with lunar light when in its extended form, which in the context of a game about the moon presence and lunar influence on the hunt is either a blessing or a brand. Something that glows like the moon in Bloodborne is never simply beautiful. Fact 121. The research hall area of the DLC contains some of the most disturbing enemy designs in the game. The patients there, who were subjected to the choir's experiments involving eye growth and perceptual expansion, have developed additional eyes across their bodies, and in some cases across their heads, replacing conventional facial features entirely. The item descriptions associated with this area make clear that the experiments were partially successful in that the patients could perceive things normal humans cannot, and partially catastrophic in that perceiving those things destroyed whatever remained of their functioning selves. The research hall is the church's best work and its worst outcome in the same building. The success and the horror are the same event described from different angles. Fact 122. Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower is widely considered one of the best boss fights in any From Software game, and the care put into her design extends beyond the mechanics. She is a Canehurst noble who became a hunter under Yharnam, participated in the fishing hamlet massacre, and was so horrified by what she did that she sealed herself in the Astral Clock Tower and refused to leave. Her fight has 3 phases that escalate as she accepts the cost of what she is doing. First, fighting conventionally, then setting her own blood on fire, then combining both. She is not trying to survive. She is trying to make sure that whatever she has to offer in exchange for you not finding what is beyond the clock tower is enough. The fight is a toll she is paying on behalf of the people she failed to protect. Fact 123. The Astral Clock Tower itself, the area Maria guards, exists at a specific intersection between the nightmare and whatever lies beyond it. The clock tower is a space that is neither fully within the nightmare nor fully outside it, and the patient enemies within it are former research subjects whose transformation has taken a more celestial direction than the crude beast plague affecting the rest of Yharnam. The tower connects downward to the nightmare and upward to something else entirely, and the progression through it is literally a movement away from the earthly toward whatever waits above. The elevator that takes you up at the end of the tower is one of the most quietly anticipatory moments in the game. You already know by that point that going up is not going to be simple. Fact 124. The Living Failures boss fight found in the research hall consists of multiple failed experimental subjects who are attempting to reach the cosmos and did not quite make it. Their attacks include channeling light from above and summoning meteors, which suggests they have partial access to something celestial, but not enough control over it to use it coherently. The fight's tone is almost elegiac because the enemies are so clearly broken, rather than malicious. They are not attacking you because they want to. They are doing the only thing they still know how to do, with the partial connection they achieved. The living failures are the research subjects who almost succeeded, and what almost succeeding looked like turned them into a group boss fight with no clear leader and no coherent goal. Fact 125. Lawrence, the first vicar, is a boss found in the DLC who represents the founding figure of the Healing Church. He is entirely transformed into a beast by the time you encounter him, which means the person who created the institution that has caused every catastrophe in the game is now one of the catastrophe's most extreme products. His skull is found earlier in the nightmare, resting in a specific location that implies it was kept as a relic or a reminder. The skull has a description that suggests Lawrence kept it himself, knowing what he would become, and placed it where it would be found after he transformed. Whether that was penance or vanity, or both, is a question the game raises and does not answer. The skull exists, the beast exists, the connection between them is everything. Fact 126. The Yharnam Puthemirian Queen boss found in the Chalice dungeons is one of the most lore-significant encounters in the game, and one that many players never see because it is at the deepest level of the most difficult dungeon chain. She is described as a queen of the Pthumerians, who served as a vessel for a Great One Child, and her connection to the blood practices that eventually led to the founding of Yharnam makes her arguably the most historically important character in the game. She does not speak. She fights with a composed and sorrowful precision that feels less like combat and more like ceremony. Her gestures toward the player during the fight have been interpreted as pleading rather than threatening. Some readings suggest she is asking you to do what you're doing. Fact 127. The chalice rituals themselves, the process by which players access the chalice dungeons, require specific materials, including ritual blood, tomb mold, and various other components found throughout the game and dungeons. The rituals are described as ancient Pthumerian practices that the Healing Church rediscovered and codified. The fact that accessing ancient underground labyrinths requires performing ancient ceremonies is consistent with the Pthumerians having built the dungeons as spaces that could only be properly entered by those who understood the correct approach. The dungeons were not simply underground buildings, they were environments that required a specific relationship with their contents in order to navigate, and the rituals are the remnant of that requirement, persisting long after most of what it was designed to protect has been disturbed. Fact 128. The sinister root chalice dungeons, the randomly generated versions that players can share online, have a different lore status than the fixed narrative dungeons. They are implied to be spaces where the chalice ritual has become unstable or corrupted, producing environments that do not match the careful design of the original Pthumerian labyrinths. The randomness itself is the lore. Something that was built with extraordinary precision and intention has been reproduced imperfectly enough that it now generates new configurations rather than replicating the original. The dungeons are still dangerous, still full of things that should not exist, but the organizing intelligence behind them has been diluted past the point of coherent purpose. What remains is the shape of a system without the mind that built it. Fact 129. The undead giant enemies in the chalice dungeons are among the most imposing regular enemies in the game, and their item drops and visual design suggest they are related to the Pthumerian giant servants found elsewhere in the labyrinths. They carry weapons that look improvised from dungeon architecture, chains and cages, and cleaver-like implements, which suggests either that they built their own weapons from available materials or that they were equipped by whoever was managing the dungeons at some point in the very distant past. Either way, they are still using those weapons. The labyrinths still function as hostile environments, even though the civilization that built them is entirely gone. The Pthumerians did not build their defences to last a generation. They built them to last indefinitely, and indefinitely has not run out yet. Fact 130. The bloodletting beast, a boss found in deeper chalice dungeons, is one of the most disturbing designs in a game full of disturbing designs. It is a beast in an extreme state of transformation whose chest cavity has been opened to reveal a secondary head or parasite within. The fight with the headless version, encountered in certain dungeon configurations, changes the combat dynamic entirely, because removing the head does not stop the beast but changes how it perceives and attacks. The implications for the lore of what exactly is inside the bloodletting beast, whether the interior creature is a parasite, a second consciousness, or the original self of whatever this was before the transformation, are left entirely open. The game shows you the inside of something and trusts you to understand that what you are seeing is worse than you initially thought. Fact 131. The Pthumerian elder boss, encountered in the Thumeru Ihil Chalice, fights primarily with a staff and with gestures that resemble religious ceremonial movements more than combat techniques. He is described as one of the last surviving Thumerian officials or priests, and his presence in the deepest dungeon layer suggests either that he retreated there as the Thumerian civilization collapsed, or that he was placed there as a final guardian of whatever the innermost chamber contains. His age, implied to be extraordinary, is visible in his hunched posture, and deliberate movements. He moves the way something that has been waiting for an extremely long time moves, not with urgency, but with the settled patience of something that always knew this was going to happen eventually, and prepared accordingly. Fact 132. The Keeper of the Old Lords, a boss found in the Ice Chalice dungeons, is wreathed in fire and surrounded by flame-based attacks. The Old Lords referenced in the title are a category of ancient and powerful entities associated with the deepest layers of Pthumerian society, distinct from the Great Ones, but occupying a similar tier of power in the Pthumerian cosmological hierarchy. The Keeper's role suggests a whole category of Pthumerian religious official dedicated to maintaining proximity to these ancient entities, which implies the Pthumerians had a more complex and stratified relationship with cosmic powers than the simplified version the surface world has inherited. The Healing Church learned from the Pthumerians. What they learned was a summary. The original text was considerably more elaborate. Fact 133. The Ice Chalice dungeons are associated with Ebrietas and contain enemy types not found elsewhere in the game, including celestial-type enemies that suggest the Ice labyrinths were built specifically in proximity to Great One activity. The Pthumerians who built the IS dungeons apparently had direct access to or contact with Ebrietas or entities related to her, and the design of those dungeons reflects that contact in every architectural and enemy choice. The deeper you go in Issir, the more alien the environment becomes, and the transition is gradual enough that you are significantly further from anything recognizably human before you notice how far you have gone. That is a design achievement. It is also a description of what happened to the Pthumerians. Fact 134. The Loran Dark Beast, one of the more electrically charged boss encounters, is a beast of extraordinary size and speed that represents what the Loran civilization presumably faced before it was destroyed. Loran, the lost land referenced in multiple Chalice dungeon items, was consumed by the beast scourge before Yharnam, which means these enormous and powerful beasts are a preview of Yharnam's eventual fate, if nothing changes. The Dark Beast does not feel like a unique abomination. It feels like a category of thing, a natural endpoint of the process that has been running through everything in the game. Yharnam is watching its own future in the Loran dungeons, and the Healing Church knows it, which may be why the dungeons are sealed and the public is not encouraged to explore them. Fact 135. The Watchdog of the Old Lords, another Chalice boss, is a massive beast surrounded by fire and described as a guardian placed by the Old Lords to protect specific chambers. It is one of the more straightforwardly Guardian-type bosses in the game, and its design is less about tragedy or complexity, and more about the raw fact that the Pthumerians built something that would still be doing its job thousands of years later, with no one left to give it new instructions. The watchdog guards because it was made to guard. That purpose has outlasted the civilization that created it, the civilization that might have threatened it, and any conceivable reason for the guarding to continue. It guards because guarding is what it is, and being what it is does not require a reason. Fact 136. The final boss of the base game, Yharnam the First Hunter, is fought in the Hunter's Dream, itself after the player chooses not to accept the release he offers. The fight is one of the most emotionally complex in From Software's catalogue, because Yharnam is not an antagonist in any conventional sense. He is an old man trying to spare you from the dream's trap by offering you the death that will free you from it. When you refuse and force him to fight, he does so with genuine skill and evident sadness, using the burial blade he built when he still believed in the hunt. Every attack he makes is technically masterful and emotionally reluctant. He is fighting you because you would not let him help you. He is still trying to help you, and fighting you is the only way left to do it. Fact 137. The Moon Presence fight, triggered by consuming 3 umbilical cords before defeating Yharnam, is one of the shortest final boss fights in any major game, and deliberately so. The moon presence is not a creature you defeat through skill and patience in the conventional sense. It is a force you resist through preparation, and if you prepared correctly, the actual encounter is brief. The brevity is the point. The game's true final boss is not a combat challenge. It is the decision to be in a position to refuse what the moon presence wants to do to you. The fight is the period at the end of the sentence. The sentence was written over the entire game. Fact 138. The ending where you become a great one, or more precisely, an infant great one, is described in the game's achievement text as a new dawn, and the doll's reaction to cradling the infant version of the hunter is one of the most carefully written moments in the game. She says something unexpected has happened, and that it must be a gift. Her tone is gentle and wondering rather than frightened, which is significant. The doll has seen hunters die, hunters transform, hunters lose everything. She responds to this transformation not with grief, but with something closer to reverence. Whatever the hunter became, the doll does not consider it a loss. That reading does not make the ending comfortable. It makes it complicated in a way that keeps returning to you after the credits finish. Fact 139. The relationship between blood and knowledge in Bloodborne is one of the game's deepest structural ideas. Blood carries properties, memories, disease, power, and heritage. Consuming the right blood can grant capabilities. Consuming the wrong blood can unmake you. The Pthumerians stored wisdom in crystallized blood. The Great Ones can be reached through blood. The Beast Plague spreads through blood. Every system in the game, mechanical and narrative, runs on blood as the fundamental medium through which the world communicates with itself. It is not a metaphor. Bloodborne takes the biological fact of blood as a carrier and extends it to cover every form of transmission the game depicts. What you are is carried in blood. What you become depends on whose blood you let in. Fact 140. The game's title, Bloodborne, contains the entire thesis. Something is carried in the blood. Something is born from it. The word born means both carried and given birth to, and both meanings are active throughout the game. The plague is bloodborne. The knowledge is bloodborne. The hunters are bloodborne, made by the blood they took and remade by what the blood did to them. Yharnam itself is bloodborne, a city whose identity, economy, architecture, religion, and catastrophe all flow from one source that was already there before the city was built. The title is not a setting description. It is a statement about causality. Everything in this game has the same origin, and the origin is still running, still flowing, still producing exactly the kinds of things it has always produced.